There is a television show that has been sitting in your living room since 1999. You have probably laughed at it. You have probably quoted it. Some of you have it on in the background right now as you fall asleep, a familiar voice in the dark keeping you company. But underneath all the cutaway gags and the laughing and the chaos, there is an entirely different story. A story about banned episodes, federal complaints, lawsuits from Hollywood legends, a feud that split the animation world in half, a death that made national headlines, and a creator who survived something so improbable that it belongs in the pages of a novel. The show is Family Guy, and this is the part they never put in the highlight reels. So settle in, get comfortable, let the night close in around you. Because this story is long, it is layered, and it is going to take you places you did not expect a cartoon about a talking dog and a dysfunctional Rhode Island family to go. Section 1. The origin story nobody tells you. Seth MacFarlane, A Missed Flight, and how Family Guy almost never existed. Before we talk about any of the controversies, before we get into the banned episodes or the lawsuits or the protests outside Fox's offices, we have to go back to where the whole thing began. And where it began is with a young man who almost never lived to see his own creation become famous. Seth MacFarlane grew up in Kent, Connecticut. By the accounts of people who knew him as a child, he was drawing before most kids his age could hold a pencil steadily. He drew constantly. He drew on grocery bags at his father's butcher shop. He drew characters from every cartoon he could find on television, the Flintstones, Woody Woodpecker, whatever flickered across the screen on a Saturday morning. He was obsessive about it in the way that people who are genuinely called to something tend to be, which is to say it was not a hobby and it was never going to be just a hobby. He made his way to the Rhode Island School of Design, which is not a school you end up at by accident. RISD, as people who know it call it, is one of the most competitive and respected art schools in the entire country. Getting in means something. And while MacFarlane was there, in the mid-1990s, he began working on a short animated film as part of his senior thesis. He called it The Life of Larry. It starred a man named Larry, a stocky, overconfident, not especially bright middle-aged man, and his dog, Steve, who was considerably more intelligent than his owner. If you have ever watched a single episode of Family Guy, you will recognize that pairing immediately. Larry and Steve would eventually, with some significant changes, become Peter and Brian Griffin. After The Life of Larry made its way to Hanna-Barbera, the storied animation house that gave the world the Flintstones and Yogi Bear, MacFarlane found himself hired. He was young. He was talented. He worked on shows like Johnny Bravo and Cow and Chicken and spent time in the writer's room of Dexter's Laboratory. It was good, solid work in animation, the kind of work that teaches you the craft that gives you a foundation to build something much larger on later. He followed up The Life of Larry with a second short called Larry and Steve, and this one made it onto Cartoon Network's What a Cartoon anthology. It was seen by executives. It was noticed, and MacFarlane, energized by the reception, began to think bigger. He built a family around Larry and Steve. He changed their names. He set them in a fictional town in Rhode Island called Stoolbend, though that name would eventually change too, to a town whose name we won't use here since it's pretty well known. Nestled in that same New England state, he developed the rest of the family. The wife who held everything together. The teenage daughter who was ordinary in an extraordinary household. The awkward son with the strange voice. The evil baby. The whole architecture of what would become one of the longest-running animated comedies in television history. He pitched it to Fox in May of 1998. He came in with a hand-animated pilot, something he had put together mostly at home, running to about 15 minutes in length, and he walked into that meeting and made his case. The people in the room saw something in it. Fox gave him $50,000 to develop the concept further. Then, after seeing what he produced with that money, they greenlit the show. Family Guy was scheduled to air in January of 1999. The speed with which this happened from a graduate student thesis, short in 1995, to a network television premiere in 1999, reflects both MacFarlane's genuine talent and the specific appetite that existed in the late 1990s for adult animated content. The Simpsons had demonstrated a decade earlier that animation was not only for children, that an animated show could attract enormous adult audiences and engage with adult themes in ways that live-action comedy sometimes could not. King of the Hill had followed in 1997. South Park had debuted in the same year. There was a market, and the market was looking for new product. MacFarlane's timing was perfect in a way that timing often has to be when careers like his get built. The talent was real, but so was the moment. The combination produced something that would outlast almost any reasonable projection for how long a show about a talking dog and a family in Rhode Island could plausibly run. And here is where the story takes on a quality that belongs in a different kind of narrative entirely. In the years following the show's premiere, MacFarlane found himself navigating the complicated early life of a television series. The show had a strong debut. The very first episode pulled in around 22 million viewers on the 31st of January 1999, right after the Super Bowl, which is the kind of scheduling gift that every network show dreams of and very few receive. Those Super Bowl numbers inflated the debut figure considerably, but even accounting for that, the show held solid ground through its first season, averaging roughly 12.5 million households per week. That was enough to make it a meaningful presence on the Fox Sunday schedule, even if it was not yet a cultural phenomenon. But the road ahead was harder than those numbers suggested. Fox had a habit in those early years of treating Family Guy somewhat carelessly. They moved it around the schedule without much warning. They put it in competitive time slots against established heavyweights. They did not protect it the way you protect something you genuinely believe in. And the ratings, without a stable home to build a loyal weekly audience, suffered. By the end of the third season, in the spring of 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy. The show was over, or so it seemed. During those years of production, of pitching and writing and recording and animating, MacFarlane was building not just a show, but an entire universe. He was the voice of Peter Griffin. He was the voice of Brian. He was the voice of Stewie. He was the voice of Glenn Quagmire. He was doing all of this while also functioning as the creative engine of the entire operation, shaping every aspect of what the show looked like and sounded like and felt like. That kind of creative output requires an enormous amount of time and energy and presence. And then, on the morning of the 11th of September 2001, while the show was still in production, still trying to find its footing after the cancellation threats had already begun, Seth MacFarlane was supposed to be on a plane. The flight was American Airlines Flight 11, departing from Boston's Logan International Airport and headed to Los Angeles. MacFarlane had been in Boston the night before, giving a speech at his alma mater. He had, by his own cheerful admission in several interviews over the years, stayed up rather late and had quite a bit to drink. A combination of that hangover and a clerical error made by his travel agent. The agent had given him the wrong departure time. Writing 8:15 in the morning rather than the actual 7:45 meant that when MacFarlane arrived at the gate, it was already too late to board. He had missed Flight 11 by roughly 10 minutes. He went to the airport lounge, sat down, and fell asleep. He woke up approximately 45 minutes later to the sound of commotion. Voices urgent in a way that cuts through even the grogginess of an interrupted sleep. He looked at the television screens mounted on the lounge walls and saw what the rest of the country was seeing in that terrible morning hour. The North Tower of the World Trade Center, on fire. And then, as he and everyone else in that lounge tried to process what they were looking at, the announcement came through about which flight it was. It was Flight 11, the flight he had been booked on, the flight he had been 10 minutes too late to board. Everyone on that flight was killed when it was deliberately flown into the North Tower at 8:46 in the morning. MacFarlane would later say in an interview with Piers Morgan on CNN what that moment was like. He described going into the lounge, falling asleep, waking to the commotion, and then sitting there watching the second plane hit. And then the announcement. And then the realization. He turned to the person next to him in the lounge and said, quietly, that the flight he had just missed was on the screen. He had come 10 minutes from being on it. Back in Los Angeles, his assistant had received a message that MacFarlane had missed his flight and would be taking a later one. But that message did not reach people in time. And for roughly 20 minutes that morning, there were people who believed Seth MacFarlane had been on Flight 11, that he was gone. That Family Guy had lost its creator before it had ever really found its audience. He had not been on it. He was alive. He was sitting in an airport lounge, watching history happen. In interviews across the years, MacFarlane has approached this story with a kind of measured thoughtfulness. He has said that he does not view it as destiny, not as some cosmic decision to spare his life for a greater purpose. He has said, in a 2004 conversation with the New York Times, that there are probably 100 close calls for all of us every year that we never even notice. He said maybe one day the full weight of what happened that morning would really settle on him. He said he tries not to assign too much meaning to it beyond what it is, which is a very strange and very lucky thing that happened. But here is what makes that story relevant to everything else we are going to talk about tonight. Because Family Guy, in the years that followed, would make jokes about September 11th. It would reference the attacks in cutaway gags. It would air an episode in which Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the original pilot, and Brian attempts to warn his past self about what is coming. That episode, called Back to the Pilot, aired in 2011 and generated its own share of controversy, with some viewers finding it deeply inappropriate that a show whose creator had nearly died in the attacks would use those same events as the backdrop for a time travel comedy. MacFarlane was asked about this on a talk show in Australia and did not shy away from the question. He said the episode was about the dangers of tampering with the past and used 9/11 as the context, not the subject. He said it was a ridiculous discussion and then said he was happy to have it anyway, in the blunt manner that has characterized most of his public statements over the years. The near miss is important because it frames who MacFarlane is. He is someone who has looked at the randomness of survival, a missed alarm, a travel agent's typo, a night of drinking, and decided not to spend his life treating the world carefully. The show he built reflects that. Family Guy has always been a show made by someone who is not particularly worried about consequences, at least not at the creative level. Whether that quality has served the show well or badly over its long run is a question we will return to many times before this story is finished. For now, though, let's stay in those early years. Because even before the big explosions of controversy, before the national headlines and the federal complaints, there were already fights happening that most casual viewers never knew about. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. There is something genuinely wonderful about knowing someone on the other side of the planet is settling in at the same moment you are. And if you haven't subscribed yet, it is one button, and it genuinely helps more than you would expect. Okay, back to the story. Section 2. The Battle with Fox Cancellations, Secrets, and the Fight to Survive. The television business is, at its core, a business. That sentence sounds obvious, but it has real consequences for creative work, and nowhere are those consequences more visible than in the early history of Family Guy. When the show premiered in January of 1999, it had the best possible launching pad. The slot immediately following Super Bowl 33 gave it an audience of roughly 22 million people, the kind of number that makes network executives feel generous and confident. The first season performed solidly. The show was new, it was different, it felt like nothing else on the Sunday night schedule. It had sharp writing and genuinely original characters, and a sense of humor that was simultaneously absurd and grounded in a recognizable suburban reality. Critics were divided on it, some loved it, some found it crude and derivative, but audiences were watching. And then Fox started moving it around. During the second season, the network shifted Family Guy to Thursday nights at 9 in the evening. This placed it in direct competition with Frasier on NBC, which was at the time one of the most critically beloved and consistently watched comedies on American television. Frasier had been running since 1993 and had won the Outstanding Comedy Series Emmy 5 years in a row. Putting a young, unproven animated show up against a cultural institution like that was not a scheduling decision so much as an execution. The ratings dropped sharply. Fox moved the show again, Tuesday nights. This time, the competition was Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC, which in the late 1990s and early 2000s was a phenomenon. Regis Philbin's game show was dominating the ratings on multiple nights a week, and Family Guy stood no chance against it in that slot. The ratings dropped again. The network kept shuffling. Different nights, different time slots, sometimes with very little advance notice, which meant that audiences who did want to watch the show could not always find it. There was no social media in those years, no way for a show to maintain contact with its viewers outside of television advertising. If Fox moved the show without telling people loudly enough, people would tune in expecting it and find something else, and some of those people would not come back. By the end of the third season, in 2002, Fox had seen enough. The ratings were too low to justify continuation. Family Guy was canceled. What happened next belongs in the category of television history that people genuinely did not expect. Cartoon Network, specifically the Adult Swim late-night programming block, purchased the rights to air reruns of the canceled show. They got those rights cheaply because canceled shows with declining ratings are not considered valuable properties, and in 2003, when the reruns began airing, nobody expected them to do much. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Family Guy became the highest-rated program on the entire Adult Swim block almost immediately. The reruns were pulling numbers that competed with cable and broadcast networks across all time slots. Adult Swim's overall viewership increased by 239% in the period following Family Guy's arrival. That is not a modest bump. That is a transformation. At the same time, Fox released DVD box sets of the first and second seasons. Those discs sold more than 400,000 copies. People were not just watching the show in reruns at midnight. They were paying money to own it. They were telling their friends about it. They were building the kind of loyal, vocal, enthusiastic audience that television executives always claim to want, but rarely know how to cultivate when they have it. Fox noticed. The network that had canceled the show twice began quietly reconsidering. By 2004, the decision had been made. Family Guy would return for a fourth season. It would air in 2005 as part of an expanded Sunday night animation block that Fox was calling Animation Domination, alongside The Simpsons and a brand new McFarlane creation called American Dad. The announcement was received as genuinely significant news in the entertainment world, because shows that get canceled do not come back. Shows that get canceled twice definitely do not come back. The whole thing was unprecedented, but there were complications building underneath the celebration that the fans could not see from the outside. When a show gets canceled and its writing staff is let go, those writers find other work. They move to other shows. They build other careers. They do not sit at home waiting for a phone call that may never come. And when Family Guy came back in 2005, the writing room was not the same room that had made the first 3 seasons. Some of the original writers who had been there at the beginning were gone. New writers had been brought in to fill the gaps. McFarlane himself acknowledged this directly, saying that one of the most damaging effects of the show's early cancellation cycle was that they were constantly having to rebuild the writing staff from scratch each time the show came back. A writing staff is not just a collection of individual talents. It is an organism. It has shared sensibilities and a shared language and a shared instinct for what fits the show and what does not. When you scatter that organism and then try to reassemble it later with new components, it takes time to find the rhythm again. Some shows find it. Some never quite do. Family Guy found something in its return. The ratings were strong. The audience was enthusiastic. The cultural moment was right, but what it found was not exactly what it had been before. There was also tension developing between McFarlane and the network itself that would only deepen over the years. McFarlane is, politically and personally, a liberal man. He has been outspoken about his views on issues ranging from environmental conservation to gay rights to the separation of church and state. Fox, the broadcast network, is owned by the same parent company as Fox News. And while the broadcast network and the news operation are technically distinct entities, the association was something McFarlane found increasingly difficult to ignore. In 2021, McFarlane posted publicly on social media, expressing his discomfort with having his show on a network connected, even tangentially, to commentary that he found disturbing. He compared his relationship with Fox to a failing marriage, in which both parties knew it was not working but neither had yet filed the paperwork. He said he wished in plain terms that Family Guy was on any other network. This is not a small thing to say when you are the creator of one of the network's longest-running and most profitable animated properties. It was not a private frustration expressed in a closed room. It was a public statement from a very visible figure, and it landed accordingly. By 2020, McFarlane had signed a deal with NBC Universal, reportedly worth around $200 million over 5 years. His production company was moving its future projects away from the Fox ecosystem entirely. The Orville, his science fiction series, had already shifted to Hulu. New properties were being developed for platforms that had nothing to do with Fox. McFarlane was, in practice, building his professional future elsewhere, while Family Guy continued to be manufactured in the house he was trying to leave. The show itself, meanwhile, kept going. Season after season, controversy after controversy, the machine kept turning. Not always because anyone involved passionately wanted it to, often because it was profitable enough to justify continuing, and in television, profitability is the most reliable argument there is. What the general public did not fully understand in those years was how deeply the institutional tension between MacFarlane and Fox affected the day-to-day production of the show. MacFarlane was still the creator of record. He was still voicing four main characters. He was still receiving enormous sums of money and enormous credit for a property that continued to be one of the network's most recognizable brands. But the creative intimacy that characterized his relationship with the show in its earliest seasons had been replaced by something considerably more transactional. By 2011, MacFarlane had officially stepped back from an active day-to-day creative role on the show. He was still in the recording booth. His voice was still in every episode. But the writing, the story planning, the creative direction of where the show was going, and what it was trying to say, those responsibilities had been handed to others. The show-running duties were taken over by Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, both of whom had been with the show for years and knew its world thoroughly. They were professionals. They were talented. They were not Seth MacFarlane. That distinction matters in ways that go beyond ego or credit. MacFarlane had a specific aesthetic. He had a specific sense of where a joke was funny versus where it was just cruel. He had an instinct for the balance between heart and chaos that had made the early seasons of the show so successful. Those instincts were not transferable in any simple way. You could know a show deeply, its characters, its history, its humor, and still not be the person who invented those things, still not have the founder's sense of when the show was drifting from what it was supposed to be. In April of 2025, it was announced that Family Guy had secured what was described as a mega deal with Disney, the parent company of Fox, extending the show through its 27th season. The deal would take Family Guy to the 2028 to 2029 television season, coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season would contain 15 episodes. The show was not just surviving. It was being guaranteed nearly 4 more years of production regardless of what the creative or rating situation looked like. MacFarlane's own public framing of this moment was revealing. In an interview given earlier in 2024, he said he did not see a good reason to stop making the show because people still loved it. He said it made people happy and it helped fund causes he cared about, including environmental conservation organizations like Rainforest Trust. He said the show had reached what he called escape velocity. It had been going long enough that there was no logical reason to end it unless the audience stopped caring. That framing the show as a vehicle for funding charitable causes, the show as something with enough momentum to continue on its own gravity, the show as something whose continuation is justified by audience demand rather than creative desire, is a very long distance from the 23-year-old who hand-animated a pitch pilot in his apartment and walked into Fox with a dream about a man and his talking dog. The MacFarlane of 1998 had something to say. The MacFarlane of 2024 had obligations to keep. Both versions are understandable, but only one of them was capable of making the thing that everyone fell in love with in the first place. Meanwhile, during the 2023 Writers Guild of America strike, MacFarlane was once again visible on the picket lines. He stood with the writers, as he had during the 2007 to 2008 strike. His support was genuine and public and consistent with his stated values. The strike disrupted Family Guy's production schedule, as it disrupted virtually every scripted show on American television. But it also had an interesting secondary effect, which was to place MacFarlane in direct opposition to the corporate structure that had been producing his show. The creator of Family Guy was picketing outside the offices of companies that were airing Family Guy. The show was the thing connecting him, even now, to an industry he had complicated feelings about. There is something in that image MacFarlane on a picket line, advocating for writers' rights, outside studios that are producing his creation, that captures the strange position he has occupied for years. He is both inside and outside the machine. He built the machine. He is paid handsomely by the machine, and he genuinely seems to believe the machine treats the people who run it badly, and he says so, loudly, even when saying so is personally complicated. It is not a simple story. It never was. The show that MacFarlane built and the institutional context in which that show exists have been in tension almost from the beginning. What is remarkable is not that the tension exists, but that it has been productive for so long, that a show built on that kind of fundamental ambivalence has lasted as long as it has. But before we get into what the show became in its later years, let us go back to the specific moments that crossed lines, that generated real-world consequences, that put Family Guy in rooms it had not planned to be in. Because the controversies are where this story gets genuinely interesting. Section 3. The banned episode stories Fox didn't want you to see. There is a certain kind of television episode that lives a strange double life. On one hand, it is a piece of entertainment, a half-hour of animated comedy. On the other hand, it becomes a document of where a show was willing to go and where the network decided the line was. Family Guy has produced several of these documents over the course of its run, and the stories behind them reveal more about the show and the culture around it than any making of documentary ever could. The first one happens early, before the show even had a chance to build the cultural weight it would eventually carry. In the third season, which originally aired in the year 2000 and 2001, the writers produced an episode called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. The premise, in the broad strokes, involves Peter Griffin developing the belief that Jewish people are inherently smarter and more financially savvy than he is, and that having a Jewish friend or advisor would solve his various money problems. He searches for a Jewish friend, eventually befriends a man named Max Weinstein, and the episode builds toward Peter deciding to have his son Chris converted to Judaism, reasoning that this will make Chris more likely to succeed in life. Lois objects strenuously. The episode ends with Peter's plan falling apart and a more nuanced, if still comedically exaggerated, message emerging. The episode also contained a song called I Need a Jew, sung to the melody of the old standard When You Wish Upon a Star. The song, delivered by Peter, expressed his belief that what was missing from his life was a Jewish advisor. The lyrics were written for comic effect, but they were built on stereotypes, and the question of whether the episode was satirizing those stereotypes or simply deploying them was one that the Fox network found too uncomfortable to resolve. Fox chose not to air the episode. It was pulled from the broadcast schedule in 2000 and held for years. The official reasoning from the network was that they were concerned it might be received as anti-Semitic, that the nuances of the satire might not translate clearly enough to prevent some viewers from taking offense on behalf of a group the writers were supposedly defending. The episode sat in a kind of broadcasting limbo, not destroyed and not forgotten, just not shown. It finally aired in 2003, 3 years after it was originally produced, on Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block. The context was the Adult Swim reruns that had sparked the revival conversation in the first place. When it was aired by Adult Swim, it went out without the controversy Fox had feared. The reaction from viewers was mixed. Some found it pointed and funny, others found it uncomfortable, but the apocalyptic backlash Fox had been bracing for did not materialize. The episode also resulted in a lawsuit that had nothing to do with its content and everything to do with the song it contained. In 2007, the music publishing company Born Co., which owns the copyright to When You Wish Upon a Star, the famous song from Disney's Pinocchio, filed a lawsuit against Fox, alleging that the parody song I Need a Jew copied the melody in a way that constituted copyright infringement. Born Co. argued that pairing what they described as a thinly veiled copy of the original melody with what they characterized as anti-Semitic lyrics damaged the value and reputation of their property. The lawsuit worked its way through the courts and was ultimately resolved in 2009 in Fox and Family Guy's favor. The legal argument came down to parody protection, the principle that a work which comments on or satirizes an original by copying elements of it is protected by the First Amendment in ways that straightforward appropriation is not. The court found that the song in Family Guy was a parody and therefore protected. Born Co. did not prevail. But the legal fight itself is interesting because it represents the first time, though not the last, that Family Guy found itself defending its comedy in a courtroom. The show had, within its first few years of existence, been both banned from its own network and sued over a song. That is a remarkable track record for a cartoon about a family in Rhode Island. The second banned episode is the more significant one, the one that still, to this day, has never aired on American broadcast television. The episode is called Partial Terms of Endearment, and it was produced as the final episode of the 8th season. The story centers on Lois Griffin agreeing to act as a surrogate mother for an old college friend named Naomi and Naomi's husband Dan. Lois and Peter navigate the emotional and physical realities of a surrogate pregnancy with the kind of absurdist humor that Family Guy typically brings to difficult subjects. Then, partway through the episode, Naomi and Dan are killed in a car accident, leaving Lois pregnant and facing a decision about what to do with the child she is carrying for a couple who no longer exists. The episode turns into a genuine, if still comedically inflected, exploration of the abortion debate. Arguments on both sides are presented. Characters take positions. The humor never entirely disappears, but it sits alongside something more serious, more uncomfortable, more genuinely challenging than the show usually attempts. By the end, Lois makes a decision, and the episode concludes in a way that Family Guy episodes rarely do, which is to say without everything neatly resolving. Fox decided not to air it. The announcement was made publicly before the 8th season even began airing, at San Diego Comic-Con in 2009, where the Family Guy team revealed that the episode existed and that it would not be shown on American television. The network's position was that the abortion subject matter was too divisive and too politically charged to put on a broadcast network that serves an audience across the full political and social spectrum of the country. The decision was interesting for several reasons. First, because Fox had not objected to many things before this. The show had aired content involving graphic violence, sexual humor, religious mockery, racial stereotyping, and jokes about nearly every sensitive topic in the cultural conversation. The network had bent on most of those. But abortion, specifically the question of abortion, was the thing that finally made them hold firm. Second, because other countries did not have Fox's reservations. The episode aired on BBC Three in the United Kingdom, where it landed in a primetime slot and was watched by over 1 million households. It received positive reviews from critics in the UK, who found it more thoughtful than they had expected Family Guy to be on a subject this charged. The episode also appeared on the Season 8 DVD box set, which meant that anyone in America who wanted to see it could find it. It was not destroyed. It was not erased. It was simply prevented from existing in its most natural form, which is to say on the television broadcast it was made for. To this day, Partial Terms of Endearment has never aired on American television. It remains the only Family Guy episode that can claim that distinction with certainty, and the story behind it says as much about the American broadcast landscape and the politics of what networks will and will not touch as it says about the show itself. Family Guy had spent years making jokes about almost everything. The one thing that turned out to be untouchable was a specific reproductive rights question handled with more seriousness and more genuine engagement than most of what the show produced. The show got banned for being thoughtful. That is a strange outcome for a series that had spent a decade getting in trouble for being reckless. The deeper lesson embedded in the story of Partial Terms of Endearment is about the nature of institutional conservatism in broadcast television. Fox was not worried that the episode would offend people in the way that most Family Guy episodes offend people. It was not worried about the Parents Television Council filing another batch of complaints. It was worried about something much more fundamental, which is that airing an episode with a coherent perspective on abortion, even a comedically inflected and genuinely ambiguous perspective, would be received as the network taking a side in the most politically divisive issue in American public life. The difference between offensive and political is worth understanding clearly. Family Guy episodes had always been offensive in ways that were scattershot, that spread discomfort across a wide enough spectrum that no single group could claim the show was systematically targeting them. The show was offensive to conservatives, to liberals, to religious people, to atheists, to everyone in approximately equal measure over time. That kind of equal opportunity offensiveness is actually a kind of political cover. If you make everyone uncomfortable, no one can credibly accuse you of being on a side. Partial Terms of Endearment was different. It was about abortion specifically and concretely. It did not satirize the debate in the abstract. It put a specific character in a specific situation and let the episode unfold around the actual decision. That decision, the decision that Lois ultimately makes, represents a choice, and a choice has implications, and implications have political consequences. Fox, a broadcast network with affiliates across the country and advertisers whose customer bases span every political persuasion, was not willing to carry those consequences. The episode was also notable for what it revealed about the show's actual creative range when it was motivated to use it. The writers of Family Guy, when they chose to, could write something genuinely different from the baseline product. Partial Terms of Endearment is a real episode with real dramatic stakes and a real emotional through line. The comedy is present, but it serves the story rather than replacing it. If you did not know it was a Family Guy episode and someone showed it to you, you might not guess immediately that it came from the same show that gave you the Conway Twitty running gag and the chicken fights and the seemingly endless cutaway to Peter hurting his knee and moaning for 45 seconds. The ban and the resulting infamy probably gave the episode more cultural longevity than it would have had if it had simply aired and been received as a moderately interesting episode of a long-running show. The forbidden quality has made it a subject of fascination that it might not otherwise have earned. Everyone who seeks it out on DVD comes to it already primed to find it more significant than it might actually be. The ban did, in that specific and ironic sense, exactly what banning things usually does, which is to make the thing being banned seem more important and more dangerous than it is. Section 4. The Boston Marathon Disaster and the Viral Lie. Of all the controversies in Family Guy's long history, the one that played out in April of 2013 is the most disturbing. Not because of what the show did, but because of what someone else did to it. The episode at the center of everything is called Turban Cowboy. It aired on the 17th of March, 2013, and it was the 15th episode of the 11th season. The main plot of the episode involves Peter Griffin becoming friends with a Muslim man named Mahmoud after a skydiving accident, and eventually converting to Islam himself, only for Mahmoud to turn out to be involved with a terrorist cell. The episode, as the show was frequently wont to do at this point in its run, handled an incredibly sensitive subject with about the same level of care as it handled everything else, which is to say it was crude, it was provocative, and it was controversial in the way most Family Guy episodes are controversial, which is a rolling, ongoing, manageable kind of controversial that generates complaints but not catastrophe. The episode contained two separate scenes that would become significant in a very different and far darker way than anyone anticipated. The first was a cutaway gag in which a flashback shows Peter having won the Boston Marathon by driving his car onto the racecourse and mowing down runners as he went. The joke was about Peter's characteristic disregard for other people and his tendency to take shortcuts of the most outrageously inappropriate kind. It was consistent with the show's humor during this period, and it had been written and animated and aired months before anything happened. The second was a scene in the main plot in which Peter accidentally detonates a bomb near a bridge, causing an explosion. These two scenes were in different parts of the episode. They were not connected to each other. They were not part of the same storyline. They were separate moments that happened to involve mass casualties, which in Family Guy terms was not unusual. On the 15th of April, 2013, 1 month after the episode aired, two brothers detonated homemade pressure cooker bombs near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. 3 people were killed. Hundreds more were injured, 17 of them losing limbs. It was one of the most horrific acts of domestic terrorism in American history, and the country was in a state of shock and grief in the days that immediately followed. Within hours of the attack, a video began circulating on the internet. Someone, and the origins of this video were deliberately obscured, had taken the two separate scenes from Turban Cowboy and edited them together. In the edited version, it appeared as though Family Guy had predicted the Boston Marathon bombing. It appeared as though the show had aired footage of exactly what was going to happen a month before it happened. The editing was skillful enough to fool people who were not looking carefully, and in the hours after a terrorist attack, very few people were looking carefully. Grief and shock and fear tend to narrow the aperture through which we process information. The video spread rapidly. Alex Jones, the conspiracy theory broadcaster, promoted it as evidence of something sinister. Social media amplified it across platforms that were not yet equipped to handle the speed at which misinformation could travel. Millions of people saw the edited footage and believed, even briefly, even partially, that there was something genuinely strange going on. Seth MacFarlane's response was immediate and unambiguous. He went to Twitter and wrote that the edited Family Guy clip circulating online was abhorrent. He called the Boston Marathon bombing a crime and a tragedy and expressed his condolences to the victims. He was emphatic that the editing of his show's content to create a false connection to a real act of terrorism was not something he was going to engage with quietly. Fox's response was also immediate. The network pulled Turban Cowboy from Hulu, from Fox.com, from Amazon, and from any streaming service where it had been available. The episode was removed from its regular broadcast rotation with a statement that there were no immediate plans to re-air it. Fox also worked with YouTube to have the edited false clip taken down, though by that point it had already been seen by an enormous number of people. The whole episode, the real episode of the show, not the edited internet fabrication, was eventually restored to streaming platforms after a period of time, and it did eventually air in reruns. But the damage had been done in a way that was harder to repair than any physical object being destroyed. The viral lie had entered the information ecosystem. Years later, you could still find people online who half believed there was something suspicious about the coincidence, who had seen the edited video and retained a vague impression of something sinister without remembering the specific debunking. What happened with Turban Cowboy reveals something about the world that Family Guy inhabits, which is a world in which the content of a television comedy can be extracted from its context, rearranged, and redistributed in a completely different form to a completely different audience for completely different purposes. The show did not predict the Boston Marathon bombing. The show did not have any connection to the Boston Marathon bombing beyond the grim and entirely accidental coincidence of a cartoon joke about a marathon that aired a month before a real attack at a marathon. But the gap between what happened and what millions of people briefly believed happened was enormous. And the gap was filled not by the show's actual content but by someone's willingness to deceive. It is worth sitting with that for a moment in the quiet of wherever you are right now. A cartoon about a talking dog and an overweight Rhode Island man became the subject of a viral conspiracy theory after a terrorist attack. The creator of that cartoon found himself having to publicly defend his show against the implication that it was somehow connected to mass murder. None of that was in anyone's plan. None of that was in the nature of the show itself. It arrived from outside, from the internet's particular capacity for transforming anything into anything else if the edit is clever enough and the moment is raw enough. Family Guy has been accused of many things over the years: being too crude, being too offensive, being too lazy, being too relentless in its pursuit of shock. But the Boston Marathon situation put the show in a category of accusation that was categorically different from all of those, and it did so through no fault of the show itself. That distinction matters, even if it took a long time for it to settle into the public record. The episode, by the way, also generated separate controversy before all of this happened, for its portrayal of its Muslim characters. The main plot of the episode had been criticized as Islamophobic by reviewers who found its conflation of everyday Muslim practice with terrorism to be reductive and harmful. That conversation was swallowed almost entirely by the Boston Marathon story when the bombing happened. In another timeline, a version of this section would be entirely about that criticism. But history moved in a different direction, and so we are here instead. It is worth spending a moment on what the YouTube editing of Turban Cowboy reveals about the information environment that Family Guy has existed in since the mid-2000s. The show premiered in 1999, before YouTube, before social media in any recognizable form, before the internet had become the primary distribution system for viral content. In those early years, a controversial episode of Family Guy was controversial in the way that things were controversial before the internet people complained to the network, or to the FCC, or to their friends. The controversy spread through television coverage and newspaper reviews and word of mouth. It spread slowly. By 2013, the situation was completely different. A single edited video posted to YouTube by an anonymous account reached millions of people within hours. The fake implication it created that Family Guy had predicted a terror attack circulated faster than any debunking could. The corrections, when they came, were seen by far fewer people than the original false clip. This is the fundamental asymmetry of misinformation in the digital age. Lies travel faster than corrections, and the emotional resonance of a shocking false claim lodges itself more firmly in memory than the calm explanation that the claim was false. McFarlane found himself in a situation that no creator in 1999 would have recognized. He had made a cartoon. Someone had edited that cartoon. The edit had been seen by millions of people in the context of a real tragedy. And he was being asked to respond to implications drawn from something he had not done. His Twitter response, direct, clear, without equivocation, was exactly the right response given the medium and the moment. But the right response does not always win in the information environment. And the Turban Cowboy situation is one example among many of why that is true. The episode itself, in the context of Family Guy's larger history of handling sensitive cultural and religious material, represents a particular kind of challenge the show has always faced. The show's default mode of handling any subject is through comic exaggeration that does not always distinguish carefully between satirizing a thing and simply deploying it as raw material for jokes. When the subject is everyday suburban life or popular culture from the 1980s, this approach is low stakes. When the subject is a specific religious group or a specific ethnicity or a historically charged political issue, the low-stakes approach becomes something else entirely. And the question of whether the show is making a point or just using someone's identity for a laugh becomes genuinely important. Family Guy has rarely engaged with that question directly. The show has generally operated on the principle that because it is equally willing to make jokes about everyone, the offense is democratized to the point where it stops being targeted. That principle has limits, and those limits become visible in situations like the Turban Cowboy episode, where the joke about a Muslim character being secretly a terrorist is one element in a landscape of jokes, and where the question of whether the joke is satirizing Islamophobia or reinforcing it does not have a clean answer. The Boston Marathon editing crisis is the dramatic event in the episode's history. But the quieter question of how the show handled its Muslim characters in that episode was present before the attack and would have warranted serious discussion even without the viral fabrication. The crisis swallowed the question. The question deserved its own airing. Section 5. The South Park War, Hollywood's nastiest animated feud. Television has always had feuds. Late-night hosts take shots at each other. Sitcom writers grumble about competing shows and interviews. Musicians shade each other in lyrics. But the feud between Family Guy and South Park is something different in kind from most creative rivalries, because it was conducted publicly, in the actual text of the shows themselves, and because the people involved were unusually willing to say exactly what they thought, rather than let the subtext do the work. The opening shot was fired in April of 2006. South Park was then in its 10th season and had evolved significantly from the crude shock comedy show it had been at its inception. Trey Parker and Matt Stone had developed into genuinely sophisticated satirists who used their show's outrageous premise to make pointed observations about culture, media, politics, and the entertainment industry itself. They had also, over the years, developed a strong opinion about Family Guy. They did not like it, and they had reached a point where they were ready to say so on television. The two-part episode Cartoon Wars gave them the vehicle. The setup involves the news that Family Guy is planning to air an episode in which the Prophet Muhammad appears on screen. The controversy this generates, mirroring a real controversy at the time involving a Danish newspaper's publication of cartoons depicting Muhammad, drives the plot. But the Muhammad angle, as compelling as it is not actually the point of the episodes. The point is revealed when Eric Cartman, the show's most reliably awful character, travels to Hollywood to get Family Guy canceled. His stated motivation is offense on behalf of Muslims. His real motivation, which Parker and Stone do not bother to disguise for long, is that he genuinely despises Family Guy and wants it off the air. And then Cartman goes inside the Family Guy studios and meets the writing staff. The writing staff of Family Guy, in the world of Cartoon Wars, is not human. It is a tank full of manatees. The manatees float in their water, selecting large colored balls from a pile, each ball with a single word or pop culture reference printed on it. They carry 5 balls at a time to a machine. The machine assembles those 5 random words into a Family Guy cutaway gag. Every joke in the show, Parker and Stone were arguing, is produced this way by dumb chance, by random assembly, by no actual thought or craft or intentionality. This was not a subtle critique. It was as direct a creative insult as it is possible to deliver in the medium of television, which is a medium that does not always reward directness. Parker and Stone were saying as plainly as they could that Family Guy was a show without real writing, that its signature comedy tool, the cutaway gag, was not the product of genuine creative thought, that you could replace any joke with any other joke and nothing would change. The reaction in Hollywood was swift and surprising. Parker and Stone have said in subsequent interviews that after Cartoon Wars aired, they received flowers from the Simpsons writing staff. They received phone calls from the writers of King of the Hill. Multiple people in the animation world contacted them to express gratitude. As Stone told it later, there was a faction in Hollywood that had been watching Family Guy's ascent with a mixture of frustration and envy, frustrated because they felt the show was succeeding on something less than genuine quality, and envious of its ratings. Cartoon Wars gave those people a moment of satisfaction. McFarlane's public response to the episode was, characteristically, measured in ways that surprised people who expected him to be defensive. He said in a Rolling Stone interview that he thought the Cartoon Wars episode was funny. He said he found the manatee concept genuinely amusing as a piece of satire. He also said that some of Parker and Stone's subsequent comments in press appearances had crossed into territory he found personally unpleasant, comments that went beyond creative criticism into something that felt more like contempt. He considered a more direct response within the show itself. One version of a retaliatory joke was reportedly written but ultimately discarded, with MacFarlane deciding that Family Guy did not have time to waste on South Park. The show's eventual comment on the feud came in 2009, in an episode called Spies Reminiscent of Us, in which Peter Griffin participates in an improv comedy show and his random, disconnected cutaway-style jokes get the biggest laughs, while more thoughtful, character-based humor falls flat. The implication is clear and self-aware, and pointed back at the South Park critique without ever naming it directly. Parker and Stone's view has remained consistent. In interviews across subsequent years, they have stated that they genuinely do not respect the writing of Family Guy. They have said that they can see there are smart people working on it and that it has the potential to be better, but that it is not working hard enough. They have compared the show's approach to comedy to everything they believe a comedy show should not do. They have never backed down from the manatee metaphor. What makes this feud interesting beyond the comedy of two animated shows arguing with each other through their own episodes is what it reveals about how the people who make these shows think about what they are doing. Parker and Stone believe that comedy requires intention, that jokes should emerge from character and situation and story. MacFarlane and the Family Guy writers believe that the best delivery system for comedy is the broadest possible reach, that a joke does not need to grow organically from the soil of a story to be genuinely funny. Both positions have merit, both have their limits. The feud is essentially a disagreement about craft staged on primetime television, which makes it one of the more intellectually interesting things that has ever happened in the world of animated comedy. The public dimension of the feud also had a downstream effect on how people talked about Family Guy. Before Cartoon Wars, the manatee critique existed in various forms in academic and critical discussions of the show, but it was not a mainstream reference point. After Cartoon Wars, it became shorthand. Online discussions about the show's writing quality would invoke the manatees. Critics comparing Family Guy unfavorably to other animated shows would reach for the image of those manatees floating in their tank, randomly assembling words into jokes. Parker and Stone had given the critique its permanent image, and that image stuck with a tenacity that no amount of subsequent quality episodes could fully dislodge. There is also a footnote to this story worth noting. MacFarlane gave a commencement speech at Harvard in 2006, the same year Cartoon Wars aired. He gave part of the speech in character as Stewie Griffin, and at one point he addressed the South Park critique directly, acknowledging with some amusement that the cutaway gags in Family Guy do not advance the plot and do not develop the characters. He said essentially that the point of them is to be funny, and that if they are funny, they are doing their job. It was a confident and self-aware response, and the Harvard audience received it warmly. But it also served as a confirmation of exactly what Parker and Stone had been saying, which is that Family Guy operates on a philosophy of comedy that treats story and character as secondary to the joke itself. MacFarlane was not embarrassed by this. He was proud of it, and that gap in perspective between him and his critics is as alive today as it was in 2006. What the South Park feud ultimately illuminates is a genuine and unresolved disagreement about what comedy is for. Parker and Stone have always operated from the premise that comedy is most powerful when it is rooted in something true about human nature, about society, about the specific characters doing the laughing and being laughed at. Their shows have stories. Their stories have stakes. When something changes in the world of South Park, the change persists and shapes what comes next. The characters grow, or they fail to grow in ways that the show comments on. Family Guy has operated from a different premise. The premise is that comedy is self-justifying, that a joke that makes you laugh has earned its place by making you laugh, and that demanding more from it is a kind of snobbery that misunderstands what comedy is doing. This is not an incoherent position. There is a long tradition of comedy that does exactly what Family Guy does, that does not apologize for its randomness, that treats the surprise and the disconnection as the point. Absurdist humor has a serious pedigree, but the manatee critique does connect to something real, which is that random comedy without emotional grounding eventually becomes exhausting. You can only be surprised so many times before surprise stops being the emotional response. And the history of Family Guy's ratings declined from roughly 8 million viewers per episode in its return year to fewer than 1 million by its early 20s, reflects in part an audience that was surprised, then amused, then habituated, then eventually indifferent. The manatees may not be a completely accurate description of how the show's jokes are generated. But the effect that the critique describes the sense that the jokes could be shuffled and rearranged without anything being lost is something that a significant portion of the show's former audience came to feel was true. Parker and Stone have maintained their position across the years. They have not apologized to anyone, manatees included. They have continued to make South Park in a way that is completely foreign to what Family Guy does rapidly, in response to the specific cultural moment of a given week, with continuity that accumulates meaning over time. Whether you find that approach more satisfying or less satisfying than Family Guy's is ultimately a personal question. But the feud between the two shows, and the clarity with which it articulated two competing theories of what animation comedy is supposed to be, is one of the more genuinely intellectually interesting events in the history of the medium. And The Simpsons writers sent flowers. That detail should never be forgotten. Section 6. The lawsuits, the copyright battles, and the Carol Burnett saga. Comedy has a complicated relationship with the law. The First Amendment protects a great deal of what comedians do, and parody in particular occupies a privileged space in American legal tradition. You are allowed to imitate. You are allowed to mock. You are allowed to take an existing work and reshape it for comedic commentary. But the boundaries of that privilege are not always obvious, and Family Guy has found itself testing those boundaries in courtrooms on more than one occasion. The most famous legal challenge the show has faced came from someone who, before the dispute, was genuinely beloved as one of the great figures of American comedic television. Carol Burnett built one of the most celebrated comedy careers of the 20th century through The Carol Burnett Show, which ran for 11 seasons from 1967 to 1978 on CBS. The show won 25 Emmy Awards. It made Burnett a household name across the entire country. It created characters that became part of the cultural vocabulary of a generation, none more famous than the charwoman, a cleaning woman character Burnett played with a mop and a particular kind of dreamy, sweet dignity. The costume the charwoman wore in the series now lives in the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian Institution. That is the level of cultural significance we are talking about. In 2005, the Family Guy production team approached Burnett and asked for permission to use the theme song from The Carol Burnett Show in an episode. Burnett declined. She said no. That should have been the end of it. It was not the end of it. In an episode from the 4th season that aired in April of 2006, titled Peterotica, a scene occurs in which Peter Griffin and his friends visit an adult bookstore. Peter, anxious that such a place will be seedy and unpleasant, is reassured by Quagmire, who tells him the bookstore is actually quite clean. And he adds, as the camera pans to a cartoon version of Carol Burnett mopping the floor in the charwoman costume with the familiar ear-tug gesture, that Carol Burnett works there part-time as a janitor. The scene was 18 seconds long. It used an altered version of the Carol Burnett Show's theme music. It depicted the most recognizable character Burnett had ever created in a pornographic establishment. And it did all of this without Burnett's permission, after Burnett had already explicitly declined a request to use her music in the show. Burnett filed a lawsuit in March of 2007 against 20th Century Fox, seeking more than $6 million in damages. She alleged copyright infringement and violation of her right of publicity. Her complaint argued that Fox, having been refused the music they wanted, had deliberately chosen to use her image and character in a demeaning context as a form of retaliation. The lawsuit characterized the decision to place the charwoman in a pornographic store as an act of spite. Fox's response, delivered through a spokesperson, was to express surprise. The network noted that Family Guy, like The Carol Burnett Show itself, was famous for its parodies and comedic treatments of public figures and cultural touchstones. Fox pointed out that Burnett had spent her entire career spoofing other people and other shows, and suggested that her decision to sue over an 18-second parody represented an inconsistency with her own creative history. The legal question was decided in June of 2007 by United States District Judge Dean D. Pregerson, who ruled in Fox's favor. The judge found that the parody of Burnett's charwoman character was protected under the First Amendment. He cited Hustler magazine v. Falwell as a governing precedent, the landmark 1988 Supreme Court case that established broad protections for satirical and parodic commentary about public figures. Pregerson noted in his decision that public figures, like Burnett, are frequent targets of parody and crude humor, and that this is a consequence of being a public figure rather than a basis for legal remedy. He also noted, in language that was both legally precise and somewhat poignant, that it takes far more creative talent to create a character like the charwoman than to use that character in a crude parody. Burnett's lawsuit failed. The judge was acknowledging that what Family Guy did was lesser than what Burnett had done, in a creative sense, but concluding that lesser creative work that comments on or parodies superior creative work is still protected. What the lawsuit revealed, though, was something about the culture inside the Family Guy production process that the Manatee debates had already hinted at. The allegation that the charwoman scene was written as retaliation because Burnett had declined the music licensing request was never formally proven in court, and Fox denied it. But the sequence of events, request, refusal, hostile depiction, created an impression that has never fully gone away. The show's response to a celebrity declining to participate was, if the allegation is true, to create a scenario in which that celebrity's most famous character cleaned floors in a pornographic shop. That is a particular kind of institutional behavior. It suggests a culture in which the refusal of cooperation is treated as an act of aggression deserving of response, in which the tools of comedy are used not just for satirical purpose but occasionally for something closer to score settling. Whether that was actually what happened in the Burnett case remains contested, but the pattern of behavior it suggests became visible in other ways as the show went on, in how it handled other celebrities who got on the wrong side of its creators, in how it treated subjects who objected to its depictions. There is also the matter of the I Need a Jew lawsuit, which we touched on briefly in the section on banned episodes. The Bourne Co. suit over the melody of When You Wish Upon a Star is worth examining a bit more carefully because of what it reveals about how far the show was willing to push the definition of parody. The claim that the song was a parody was grounded in the argument that it was commenting on the original by applying its melody to a completely different and satirically charged context. The Bourne Co. argued that the new lyrics were not genuinely commenting on the original song, which is about innocence and wishing and hope, but were simply using its melody as a vehicle for humor that had nothing to do with the original. That distinction between true parody and parody as a legal shield for appropriation is one that courts have handled inconsistently over the years, and in this case, Fox won. But the lawsuit and the legal argument it generated have echoed in subsequent discussions of where Family Guy draws its inspiration and how it treats the work of others. The show's relationship with intellectual property is, in the most charitable framing, complicated. In a less charitable framing, it is sometimes exploitative. The cutaway gag format, by its nature, involves rapid reference to enormous numbers of cultural products, films, songs, television shows, public figures, historical events. The speed and volume of these references makes individual vetting difficult, and the show has always operated on the assumption that parody and fair use provide a broad enough umbrella to cover most of what it does. In most cases, that assumption has been correct. In a few cases, as with the Burnett situation and the Bourne Co. situation, it has been tested in court. The courts have generally sided with Family Guy. That does not make the behavior that generates the lawsuits admirable. It makes it legal, which is a different thing. Section 7. The Watchdog Wars, the PTC, the FCC, and 188,000 complaints. If you were to map the enemies of Family Guy on a chart, the Parents Television Council would occupy the most prominent position. It would be a large dot, heavily weighted, sitting in the upper left corner of whatever axis represents sustained institutional antagonism toward a single animated television program. The Parents Television Council, or PTC, is a conservative nonprofit advocacy group founded in 1995 by L. Brent Bozell III, a media critic and political commentator. The organization's stated mission is to protect children from what it characterizes as harmful content in popular entertainment. It monitors television programming, issues reports on content it finds objectionable, rates shows on moral grounds, and encourages its membership to file formal complaints with the Federal Communications Commission. At its peak, the PTC claimed a membership of more than 1 million individuals, and it used that membership as a lever to amplify its complaints with networks and advertisers. Family Guy became a primary target for the PTC almost from the moment of its premiere. In its very first year of existence, 1999, critics aligned with the PTC's general outlook were already characterizing the show in damning terms. The entertainment writer Ken Tucker, in Entertainment Weekly, called it racist, anti-Semitic, and full of AIDS jokes and shoddy animation. L. Brent Bozell III wrote a column criticizing an episode called Holy Crap for what he characterized as anti-Catholicism. The show was weeks old, and it was already being described in those terms by people whose professional purpose was to monitor exactly this kind of content. The PTC has designated Family Guy the worst TV show of the week on at least 40 separate occasions since 2005. That is not a minor or occasional designation. That is a sustained, years-long campaign of official condemnation. The PTC also pressured advertisers directly, approaching companies like the Wrigley Company and Burger King and urging them to withdraw their advertising from the show on the grounds that products marketed to children should not be seen during programming that depicted graphic sexual content and violence. Some advertisers pulled back, others did not. The show continued. The relationship between the PTC and Family Guy became, over the years, almost adversarial in a way that both parties seemed to find energizing. MacFarlane did not ignore the PTC, he engaged with it. He mocked it directly in the show through the episode PTV, in which Peter Griffin starts his own television network as a response to FCC censorship, and the PTC's style of complaint-driven pressure is satirized through the Family Television Council, a thinly veiled analog that appears in the episode. The PTC considered filing a formal FCC complaint over PTV itself, which would have been the elegant absurdity of filing a complaint over an episode that was itself about the process of filing complaints. The single most dramatic expression of the PTC's campaign against Family Guy came in 2009, in the months following the airing of a 7th season episode called Family Gay. The episode's central plot involves Peter Griffin volunteering for medical experiments in order to earn money. One of the experiments involves injection with what the show describes as the gay gene, causing Peter to become romantically attracted to men. The episode contains a variety of comedically exaggerated depictions of gay culture, a gay bar scene, a relationship between Peter and another man, and a subplot involving a terminally ill horse with brain damage. The episode also includes, in keeping with the show's approach to physical comedy in this period, various scenes that push into territory that would today be described as extremely graphic, including one that involves Stewie Griffin at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal, and something that the PTC described, in its formal complaint, as horse sperm rather than milk. The PTC mobilized. They filed a formal complaint with the Federal Communications Commission and urged their membership to do the same. The results were extraordinary in scale. The FCC received a total of 188,368 complaints about Family Gay. That number is worth sitting with. Over 188,000 people filed formal federal complaints about a single episode of an animated comedy. The PTC had turned complaint filing into a coordinated political action, and the action was massively effective in terms of generating a documented record. The FCC reviewed the episode and ultimately declined to take enforcement action. The agency's reasoning reflected the nature of what had actually been aired. The content of Family Gay, while offensive to a significant portion of the viewing public, did not meet the legal standard for broadcast indecency that the FCC is empowered to act upon. The episode was not explicit in the legal sense. It was crude, it was provocative, it was deliberately offensive, but it fell within the range of content that the First Amendment protects and that the FCC cannot restrict on broadcast television in the manner the PTC was seeking. The show had survived 188,000 federal complaints. The episode PTV, which had aired earlier, was MacFarlane's most direct response to this entire dynamic. The episode is an extended meditation on censorship, on the relationship between broadcast networks and regulatory bodies, on who gets to decide what is too offensive for public consumption. It depicts Peter setting up his own television channel that broadcasts out of his house, and the FCC arriving to censor him. The episode was funny, it was pointed, and it was a clear statement of MacFarlane's belief that the kind of pressure the PTC was applying represented a threat to creative expression that was worth resisting publicly and loudly. The PTC responded to PTV by considering a complaint filing of their own, then apparently deciding against it. The irony would have been too rich. The organization that had filed complaints about Family Guy's content was being invited to file a complaint about a Family Guy episode specifically making fun of the process of filing complaints about Family Guy. It would have completed a circle that even the show's writers probably did not fully anticipate. What is genuinely interesting about the PTC campaign, viewed from a distance, is that it was simultaneously ineffective in its stated goals and enormously effective in its actual cultural impact. The FCC never fined the show. The show never changed its content in response to PTC pressure. But the PTC's reports and complaints generated enormous amounts of press coverage, which kept Family Guy in the news and kept the conversation about its content alive in ways that the show itself could not have engineered. The PTC, in trying to bring Family Guy down, kept giving it relevance. They were, in a sense that neither party would appreciate, partners in building the show's reputation as genuinely dangerous television. By 2015, the situation had reached an almost surreal conclusion. After a particularly pointed PTC complaint about a joke in an episode called Our Idiot Brian, McFarlane did something unexpected. He reached out to PTC President Tim Winter and offered him the chance to either write a Family Guy episode himself or to designate 2 writers of his choosing to write one. The offer was sincere enough to catch Winter off guard. The 2 men entered a period of direct communication in which actual concerns were expressed and actual responses were given, and somewhere in that conversation, an unlikely thing happened. The war did not exactly end, but it changed shape. McFarlane and Winter developed what could charitably be described as a working understanding, and the ferocity of the PTC's campaign against Family Guy moderated, at least somewhat. It was a strange ending to more than 15 years of institutional combat. 2 people who had functioned as adversaries sat across from each other, talked, and found the situation more complicated than either had publicly presented it to be. That outcome does not rehabilitate everything the show did or vindicate the PTC's methods. But it does suggest that the feud had been, at least in part, a performance on both sides. There are other episodes in the show's history that generated FCC complaints beyond the Family Guy situation, though none reached that same extraordinary number. The episode PTV itself, which was Family Guy's extended satirical response to the entire FCC complaint ecosystem, generated its own brief moment of regulatory attention. The irony of an episode about filing complaints, receiving complaints was not lost on anyone, but the PTC reportedly decided not to pursue a formal FCC complaint over PTV, which suggests that even they recognize the specific absurdity of that particular action. The relationship between Family Guy and the FCC reflects something broader about the history of broadcast regulation in the 2000s and 2010s. The FCC was designed for a world in which broadcast television was the dominant medium for entertainment, in which a relatively small number of networks controlled what millions of people saw in their homes during specific hours of the day and evening. The idea behind broadcast content standards was that the public airwaves belong to the public, and that organizations using those airwaves have an obligation to the broadest possible public audience, including children. By the time Family Guy returned from cancellation in 2005, that world was already changing rapidly. Cable television offered viewers enormous amounts of content that was subject to very different standards than broadcast. The internet offered even more. The iPhone had not yet been introduced, but the architecture of an entirely different media landscape was already becoming visible. In this environment, the FCC's enforcement authority over broadcast content was simultaneously more aggressive. The Janet Jackson Super Bowl incident in 2004 had prompted a period of intensified regulatory attention and more. Structurally irrelevant, since the content that was genuinely pushing boundaries was migrating away from the broadcast spectrum that the FCC regulated. Family Guy existed during its most controversial years, precisely on the fault line of this transition. It was a broadcast show, subject to FCC oversight, but it was behaving like a cable show in terms of its willingness to push content boundaries. This created the specific regulatory tension that the PTC was trying to exploit. They were using a broadcast-era tool, the FCC indecency complaint, against a show that was culturally and creatively operating in a post-broadcast sensibility. That the FCC never actually fined the show reflects, in part, the genuine legal and philosophical difficulty of applying 1950s-era broadcast standards to the kind of content that audiences in 2009 were finding online and on cable without any complaint process being available to them. McFarlane understood this dynamic and used it consciously. He knew that the FCC's hands were increasingly tied by both legal precedent and cultural change. He knew that the PTC was fighting with declining institutional authority. The episode PTV is funny, but it is also a declaration of position. It says, clearly, that Family Guy considers itself to be on the right side of the censorship debate and that the forces trying to limit what it can do are engaged in something that is both legally weak and culturally wrong. Whether you agree with that position depends on your views about what entertainment is allowed to do and what obligations come with access to the public airwaves. What the PTC campaigns did accomplish, beyond generating enormous amounts of press for a show that was doing perfectly fine in the press already, was to create a paper record of Family Guy's most controversial content decisions. The PTC's reports, their complaints to the FCC, their weekly designations of Family Guy as the worst show on television. All of these are archived, documented, findable. They constitute an institutional record of what the show was doing in specific years that the show's own promotional materials would never have provided. In that sense, the PTC inadvertently created one of the most thorough contemporary archives of Family Guy's controversial content, which is a deeply funny outcome for an organization whose stated goal was to make the show stop doing what it was doing. Section 8. The Sarah Palin Showdown and the Down Syndrome Controversy. Political satire is one of the oldest forms of comedy. Rulers have been mocked in art and theater and literature since long before there was television, and political figures who enter public life accept, as a condition of that choice, a certain amount of mockery. They forfeit some of the privacy and protection that private citizens retain. That principle is not seriously contested in American law or in American cultural practice. But there are situations in which political satire involves other people who did not make the same choice, and those situations are more complicated. In February of 2010, Family Guy aired the 8th episode of its 8th season, titled Extra Large Medium. The main storyline involves Chris Griffin developing a romantic interest in a girl at his school named Ellen, who has Down syndrome. The episode handles the relationship with the show's characteristic blend of genuine warmth and comic exaggeration, and Ellen is portrayed with significant comedic punch as not being a sweet or passive figure. She is demanding, bossy, and more than capable of making Chris miserable, which the show presents as a subversion of the expectation that a disabled character will exist primarily to teach other characters lessons about acceptance and kindness. Early in the episode, Ellen delivers a line describing her parents. Her father, she says, is an accountant. Her mother, she says, is the former governor of Alaska. The line is brief, it is a joke, and it is aimed at a specific target. Sarah Palin had served as the governor of Alaska until her resignation in 2009. Her youngest son, Trig Palin, was born in 2008 and has Down syndrome. The reference in the episode was pointed and deliberate. Palin's response came quickly and forcefully. She posted to her Facebook page. She included a statement from her daughter Bristol, who wrote that people with special needs face challenges that many people will never confront, and questioned whether there are any limits to what entertainment will do or say regarding her younger brother. The Palin family's position was that the episode was using Down syndrome as a punchline to mock their family, and specifically mocking Trig Palin, who had not chosen public life and was a young child who could not respond to or participate in the discussion about how he was being represented. McFarlane defended the episode. He argued that the joke was aimed at Sarah Palin, not at her son or at people with Down syndrome generally. He pointed out that the character of Ellen was voiced by someone who actually has Down syndrome and was not a victim of the episode but a participant in it. And then the actress who voiced Ellen weighed in, and the whole narrative shifted. Andrea Faye Friedman, who at the time was 39 years old and had been working as an actress since appearing in the television series Life Goes On in the early 1990s, was born with Down syndrome. She had been hired by the Family Guy production team specifically because she has the condition, and she performed the role of Ellen with full knowledge of the joke the show was making. When Palin's response became public, Friedman sent a letter to the New York Times. In it, she said she guessed that former Governor Palin does not have a sense of humor. She said she thought the line about being the daughter of the former governor of Alaska was very funny. She invoked the word sarcasm. She said that in her family, laughing is good, and that her parents raised her to have a sense of humor and to live a normal life. In a portion of the letter that was shared by various outlets, Friedman added a line that became widely quoted. She wrote that her mother did not carry her around under her arm like a loaf of French bread, the way former Governor Palin carries her son Trig around looking for sympathy and votes. The response from the woman at the center of the controversy was not what Palin or her supporters had anticipated. The conversation was supposed to be about the exploitation of Down syndrome for political comedy. Friedman's letter reframed it entirely. Here was someone with Down syndrome, someone who had performed the role in question, saying explicitly that she was proud of it, that she was not embarrassed, that she was making fun of Sarah Palin, not of Trig Palin or of people with Down syndrome. The situation became complicated in a way that neither the show's critics nor its defenders had fully anticipated. Friedman's perspective did not resolve the question of whether the joke was in good taste or appropriate. Those are questions that reasonable people can disagree about. But it did radically complicate the narrative that the episode was straightforwardly cruel to a vulnerable group. What the episode and its aftermath revealed was something about the specific challenges of political satire involving third parties. Palin had made herself a public figure. The joke about the former governor of Alaska was within the territory of legitimate political mockery. But the vehicle for that joke was a character with Down syndrome, and that vehicle connected the satire to Trig Palin, who was neither a politician, nor a public figure, nor someone who had any say in how he was represented. The question of where the satire ended and where an innocent child's identity began was one the episode did not cleanly answer, and that ambiguity is what kept the controversy alive long after both sides had said their piece. Palin and MacFarlane never reached any formal reconciliation. The episode remained in the show's canon. Andrea Faye Friedman went on to work in other television productions before her death in December of 2023 at the age of 53, after a long battle with Alzheimer's disease. Her performance in that Family Guy episode and the letter she wrote afterward remain among the more unexpected and genuinely interesting moments in the show's entire history of controversy. The Parents Television Council filed their own complaint about the episode during its original broadcast. At this point, this fact probably does not surprise anyone. Section 9. The Death and Resurrection of Brian Griffin. In November of 2013, Family Guy killed its dog. That sentence sounds absurd out of context, but within the world of the show and within the culture around it, the death of Brian Griffin was treated as a significant event. It made national news. It trended on social media for days. Petitions were signed. The entertainment press covered it as though a real figure had died, and the reaction revealed something about the depth of attachment that viewers had formed with a cartoon character over 14 years. The episode is called Life of Brian, and it is the 6th episode of the 12th season. The setup is simple. Brian and Stewie are playing street hockey outside the Griffin house when Brian runs into the street after a ball and is struck by a car. The show does not treat this as a comedy moment. The scene is relatively quiet and played with a kind of restraint that Family Guy does not usually deploy. Brian is taken to a veterinary clinic. The damage is too severe. The family gathers around him and Brian, voiced by MacFarlane in what is genuinely one of the more affecting performances the show ever produced, says goodbye. The Griffin family are devastated. Stewie is particularly destroyed. The connection between Stewie and Brian had been one of the most consistent sources of genuine emotional depth in the show's post-revival years, and the episode leaned into that relationship in its final moments with real feeling. A replacement dog named Vinny appeared in subsequent episodes, voiced by Tony Sirico, who was best known for playing Paulie Walnuts in The Sopranos. Vinny was a character with real comedic potential, an Italian-American dog from New York with a completely different personality from Brian's, but fans never warmed to him. He felt like the show explaining that it knew Brian was irreplaceable by giving them something obviously not replaceable, which made the loss more rather than less acute. The backlash was intense and almost immediate. Petitions calling for Brian's return gathered signatures in the hundreds of thousands. Social media was flooded with expressions of grief that ranged from genuine sadness to performative outrage to something in between. The entertainment press wrote about it with a seriousness that surprised people who did not watch the show. The producers found themselves in the unusual position of having to respond to a level of public emotion about a fictional cartoon dog that they had not anticipated, or so they claimed. 2 episodes later, on the 15th of December 2013, an episode called Christmas Guy aired. In it, Stewie, in his misery over losing Brian, travels to a mall with Vinny and encounters a past version of himself. He manages to obtain a time travel device that his past self had been carrying, and he uses it to travel back to the moment before Brian was struck by the car. He saves Brian's life. Brian comes back. Vinny disappears. Everything returns to the status quo. The internet, which had been full of grief 3 weeks earlier, was now full of relief and celebration. The whole thing had been a 3-episode arc. Brian's death, the grief, the replacement, and the resurrection had played out across less than a month of real time. The reaction to the resurrection was itself divided. Some fans were genuinely delighted, others were furious. The argument that the death had been a rating stunt was now impossible to dismiss. The show had killed one of its central characters, generated enormous press coverage and emotional investment, and then reversed the death within the same season, before anyone had time to adjust to the new reality. If the death had been intended as a permanent change, the reversal would not have come so quickly and so neatly. The speed of the turnaround suggested that the reversal had always been planned, that the death was never intended to be permanent, that the whole thing was designed to get people talking and watching in the specific window leading up to Christmas. MacFarlane was asked about this dynamic in interviews. He pushed back on the rating stunt characterization while simultaneously acknowledging that the show had always intended to bring Brian back. He framed it as a 3-part story without the words "to be continued" at the end of each episode. He said the goal was to remind audiences that in this show, anything can happen. He said the intensity of the fan reaction surprised the production team. Whether or not you believe that the surprise was genuine, the episode surrounding Brian's death and resurrection tells us something important about what Family Guy had become by 2013. The show had developed characters with enough depth and emotional resonance that killing one of them made national news. That is a meaningful achievement. But the decision to reverse that death within 3 episodes suggests a fundamental unwillingness to live with the consequences of genuine storytelling. The show wanted the impact of a real death without accepting the reality that death creates the permanent alteration of relationships, the absence that doesn't fill, the changed world that the remaining characters have to navigate. Family Guy got the press coverage, it got the emotional reaction, it got the ratings bump, and then it pressed the reset button, got Brian back, and continued as before. The moment is a precise crystallization of something the show had been doing for years across smaller decisions and smaller stakes. It gestures toward consequence and then retreats from it. It offers the sensation of significance without the actual weight. And in doing so, it demonstrated exactly what its critics had been saying for years: that the show could produce genuine emotional moments, but lacked the courage or the commitment to let those moments mean anything lasting. Stewie's grief in Christmas Guy is genuinely touching. The scene in which he realizes he can save Brian, and the moment of reunion, is emotionally effective in a way that the show does not always manage. But the frame around that scene, the knowledge that Brian's death was temporary, that the whole thing was a planned shock, hollows it out slightly. You are moved, and you know you were meant to be moved, and you know the moving was engineered, and those 3 things sitting together create a complicated viewing experience. Brian went on to appear in every subsequent season. The character continued to be controversial in his own right, for reasons that had nothing to do with his death. But the Life of Brian and Christmas Guy episodes remain among the most discussed in the entire history of the show, not because they were the best episodes, but because they were the moment when Family Guy most visibly showed its hand about what it was willing to do to get attention. The particular nature of the fan reaction to Brian's death is worth examining because it tells us something about the relationship between long-running television shows and the audiences who watch them. Over 14 seasons, Brian Griffin had become a presence in the lives of millions of people in a way that is specific to serial narrative entertainment. He had been there, week after week, year after year, through the moments when people watched the show as children and then revisited it as adults, through the episodes they watched alone and the ones they watched with other people, through the background noise of 100,000 different evenings. That kind of sustained presence creates a relationship that is not quite like other relationships but is also not nothing. When Brian died, the fans who petitioned for his return were not losing their grip on reality. They were responding to a genuine rupture in something they had long taken for granted. That rupture was manufactured. It was a creative decision made by writers who knew they could reverse it, and who did reverse it within the same season, but the emotional response it produced was not manufactured. People felt something real. The engineering of that feeling, the deliberate production of grief in an audience as a rating strategy, is what bothered critics and more detached observers. The grief itself was legitimate. What made the situation more uncomfortable was the replacement character. Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico, with a thick New York accent and a completely different personality from Brian's, was not a bad character in isolation. Sirico, whose fame from The Sopranos gave the character instant cultural resonance, gave Vinny a distinct warmth and a comedic bluntness that had its own appeal. In a different show, Vinny might have been a genuinely interesting addition to the cast. In Family Guy, he existed under the shadow of Brian's absence, and that shadow made it impossible for audiences to evaluate him on his own terms. He was not Brian. That was the beginning and the end of the assessment for most viewers. The speed of Brian's resurrection within a single season, across 3 episodes, made the emotional arc of the whole storyline collapse on itself retroactively. If Brian had been dead for a full season, if the show had committed to living with that change for 22 episodes before finding a way to reverse it, the story would have said something different. It would have demonstrated that the show was capable of accepting real consequences. The 3-episode arc said something much more specific, which is that the show was capable of manufacturing the appearance of consequences for exactly long enough to generate maximum media attention, and then returning to the status quo before the audience had time to actually adjust. This is, as noted in the transcript that served as context for this video, a pattern that runs through Family Guy's entire post-revival history. The show sets up consequences and then avoids them. Characters have moments of genuine growth, and then the growth is erased. Relationships change, and then they change back. The reset button is pressed, and the machine continues. Brian's death and resurrection is the most dramatic expression of this pattern, the one that played out on the largest possible stage with the largest possible audience watching. It is fitting that it involved the character who had always been the show's most complex creation, the one who had started as the show's emotional anchor and then drifted into territory that made him both fascinating and infuriating. Even in his death, Brian was the most narratively interesting person in the room. And even in his resurrection, the show found a way to make the emotion of the moment feel real while refusing to let it mean anything permanent. Section 10. Screams of silence. When Family Guy went too far. There is a particular kind of failure that is more frustrating than simple badness. Simple badness is a show not trying. Simple badness is laziness or indifference or running out of ideas. But there is a worse thing, which is a show attempting something serious, attempting to address a real and painful subject with genuine weight, and failing in ways that make things worse rather than better. That is what happened in October of 2011 with the episode Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q. The episode is the 3rd of the 10th season, and it tells the story of Brenda, the sister of Glenn Quagmire. Quagmire, in the regular run of the show, is not a sympathetic character. He is a womanizer. He has behaved, across the series run, in ways that would in any other context be characterized as predatory toward women. The show has historically treated this as comedy. His name has become internet shorthand for a particular kind of aggressively lecherous male behavior. Quagmire is not a good person in the world of Family Guy, and the show has never pretended that he is. Brenda, who had appeared briefly as a visual gag in a previous episode, is revealed to be in a relationship with a man named Jeff, who physically and emotionally abuses her. The abuse is not depicted in the show's usual cartoonish way, with exaggerated slapstick violence that bounces off characters and leaves no lasting mark. It is depicted with something approaching seriousness. Jeff hits Brenda. Jeff controls Brenda. Jeff threatens Brenda. The episode plays these scenes in a way that is designed to make the audience uncomfortable rather than to get laughs from them. This is where the episode runs into its first problem. Family Guy is a comedy. Its visual language, its pacing, its character relationships, its internal logic, all of these things have been established over a decade as the language of exaggerated cartoon humor. When a show with that established language suddenly asks you to take something seriously, the ask is complicated by everything you already know about the show you are watching. The tonal shift is jarring in a way that works against the serious material rather than in service of it. The second problem is what the episode says about domestic violence and about the people who stay in abusive relationships. Throughout Screams of Silence, Brenda is portrayed as someone who cannot leave. She rationalizes Jeff's behavior. She makes excuses for him. She defends him to her brother and to Peter and Joe, who confront her about what they can clearly see happening. The episode does try to acknowledge that leaving an abusive relationship is complicated, that the psychology of abuse traps people in ways that outside observers do not always understand. But the way the episode frames this is ultimately less compassionate than it intends to be. Brenda comes across not as a victim navigating an impossibly difficult situation, but as someone defined entirely by her inability to act on her own behalf. The episode positions her as someone things need to be done to, rather than someone capable of agency. The resolution of this problem is where the episode crossed a line that many viewers and critics found deeply troubling. Quagmire, Peter, and Joe decide that the solution is murder. They arrange to kill Jeff so that Brenda can be free, and they succeed. Jeff is killed, the relationship is ended, and Brenda is left free to build a life without her abuser, though the episode does not spend much time on what that life looks like. The implicit message that the correct response to an abusive relationship is for the victim's male friends and family members to commit murder is one that domestic violence advocates found alarming. The episode, in trying to be a serious treatment of a serious subject, ended up delivering the message that the victim's own decisions and agency are irrelevant to her liberation. What frees Brenda is not Brenda choosing to leave, not Brenda finding the support and resources to make her situation safer, not Brenda making any kind of autonomous decision at all. What frees Brenda is men deciding that her abuser needs to die and acting on that decision. Critics were blunt in their responses. A.J. Hammer on Showbiz Tonight described the episode as a depressing half-hour of television and said he was just shocked by what he saw. Television host Wendy Walsh characterized the episode as showing a woman too dumb to leave her relationship and observed that domestic violence is far more complicated than that. She said that what the show portrayed was the kind of thought process that actually exists in abusive relationships, but that the framing of Brenda as stupid rather than trapped was a fundamental misunderstanding of how abuse works. The episode was also criticized on a meta level that becomes more visible the more you think about it. The principal advocate for Brenda's liberation is Glenn Quagmire, a character whose own behavior toward women the show has depicted for years as ranging from disrespectful to predatory. Quagmire lecturing anyone about how a woman should be treated, Quagmire positioning himself as a protector of female safety, required the audience to set aside enormous amounts of what the show had already established about who Quagmire is and what he does. The episode did not acknowledge this irony. It asked you to take Quagmire's outrage at Jeff seriously without addressing the obvious question of how different Quagmire's behavior really is from what he is condemning. Domestic violence organizations noticed the episode and said so publicly. The criticism was not the rolling, generalized controversy that typically surrounds Family Guy episodes. It was specific, and it was aimed at something real, which is the way entertainment depicts abusive relationships and what messages those depictions send to people who may be living them. The episode is frequently cited in lists of the worst Family Guy episodes ever produced. It ranks at or near the top of many fan and critic compilations of the show's most misguided creative decisions. WatchMojo's list of the 20 worst Family Guy episodes ranked it at number 1. This is notable because the competition is fierce. There are many Family Guy episodes that fans and critics consider deeply problematic, and Screams of Silence earned that position not for being crude or lazy, but for being well-intentioned and catastrophically wrong. There is a version of this episode that works. The premise exploring the reality of an abusive relationship through the lens of Quagmire's family is not inherently flawed. Shows can address dark subjects seriously. Family Guy itself has demonstrated, in episodes like Brian and Stewie, that it can go to genuinely uncomfortable emotional places when it commits fully to the material. But Screams of Silence did not commit. It wanted the weight of a serious subject and the resolution of a comedy. And the combination produced something that was neither. The fact that the episode also involves the murder of an abuser, presented without real moral reckoning or consequence, makes the whole thing more troubling in retrospect. Jeff is killed, and the episode does not particularly concern itself with what that means ethically or practically. The murder is presented as justice, as the clean solution that the victim herself was unable to achieve. That framing that violence committed by the victim's male protectors is the appropriate resolution is exactly the kind of storytelling that advocates for abuse victims have spent decades arguing against. It reduces the victim's story to a backdrop for male action and male resolution, and it does so while believing it is being supportive and progressive. Family Guy has made many things that were offensive in ways that were at least honest about being offensive. Screams of Silence is in a different category. It is offensive in the specific, damaging way that comes from good intentions applied without adequate thought or research or empathy for the people whose experiences it was trying to represent. Section 11. Behind the Microphone Voice Cast, Controversies and the Cleveland Problem. The voice cast of Family Guy represents one of the most stable working arrangements in the history of animated television. MacFarlane has voiced Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire since the beginning. Alex Borstein has voiced Lois since the beginning. Seth Green has voiced Chris since the beginning. Mila Kunis took over the role of Meg from Lacey Chabert starting in the second season and has held it ever since. Mike Henry voiced Cleveland Brown from the very first episode. That last sentence requires a past tense now, because in 2020, everything changed. Cleveland Brown is one of the few black main characters on Family Guy. He appeared in the show from its premiere in 1999, voiced by Mike Henry, a white writer and actor who had been involved with the show from early in its development. Henry also voiced Cleveland in The Cleveland Show, a spin-off that ran from 2009 to 2013 on Fox, maintaining the character across both properties for more than 2 decades. Over all that time, the fact that a white man was voicing a black main character was not the subject of significant public controversy. It was the industry norm. Animated characters have always been voiced by people who do not match the physical or demographic characteristics of the characters they are playing, and the argument for this practice is that voice acting is fundamentally a performance art with no visual component, making the physical identity of the performer theoretically irrelevant. That argument began to be challenged seriously in the summer of 2020 in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and the global conversation about racial representation in entertainment that followed George Floyd's death in May of that year. The question of whether white voice actors should continue to voice black characters became part of a broader reckoning about who gets to represent whom in storytelling and who benefits economically from those decisions. Several animated shows found themselves in the middle of this conversation simultaneously. The cast of Big Mouth included Jenny Slate, who is white, voicing a mixed-race character. She announced she would step down from the role. The cast of Central Park included Kristen Bell, who is white, voicing a mixed-race character. She also stepped down. And Mike Henry, watching these conversations unfold, made his own announcement. On the 26th of June, 2020, Henry posted on social media saying that it had been an honor to play Cleveland on Family Guy for 20 years. He wrote that he loved the character, and then he wrote that persons of color should play characters of color, and that he would therefore be stepping down from the role. The announcement was received across a wide spectrum of reactions. There were people who praised Henry for recognizing the issue and acting on it without waiting to be forced. There were people who criticized the decision as performative, as a response to social pressure, rather than a genuine ethical stance that had been held for years. There were people who questioned why this conversation had not happened 20 years earlier when the show was first cast, and there were people who focused on the practical question of who would take over. The answer came in September of 2020. Arif Zahir, a 24-year-old YouTuber with more than 6 million subscribers, was announced as the new voice of Cleveland Brown. Zahir had built much of his YouTube following through impressions of various characters, including Cleveland Brown, and his ability to capture the character's voice was not in question. He spoke publicly about the opportunity with evident excitement and an awareness of the weight of the situation. Zahir's first appearance as Cleveland came in season 19 of Family Guy, and the transition has continued without major incident in the years since. The show made no in-universe acknowledgement of the change. Cleveland sounds the same to casual viewers. The character's identity and role in the ensemble have not changed. But the circumstances that led to the change, the 2 decades during which a white actor voiced a black character on a major television show without significant public controversy, followed by a social moment in which that arrangement suddenly became impossible to sustain, are worth examining beyond the specific logistics. The question of why this took 20 years to resolve has multiple layers. Part of the answer is that the entertainment industry has always been slow to change practices that are economically comfortable and institutionally established. Part of it is that the standards by which representation in entertainment is evaluated change over time, sometimes gradually and sometimes rapidly, and what is accepted in one era becomes untenable in another. Part of it is that the specific moment of summer 2020 created a cultural atmosphere in which decisions that had always been defensible became suddenly indefensible in ways that powerful people within the industry could feel. Henry's decision was voluntary, which matters. He was not forced out. He chose to step down. Whether that choice reflects a genuine change in his understanding of the issue or a reading of the cultural moment that made staying in the role professionally costly is something only he knows. What he said publicly was that persons of color should play characters of color, and that he was acting on that belief. The fact that he held the role for 20 years before arriving at that belief publicly is a complexity that his statement did not address and that observers have noted with varying degrees of charity. The Cleveland situation is also interesting in the context of the show's broader relationship with race. Family Guy has, across its run, made enormous numbers of jokes involving racial stereotypes. Some of these jokes have been satirical, in the sense that they were designed to illuminate the absurdity of the stereotypes they were invoking. Others have been cruder, simply deploying stereotypes for comedic effect without particular intention beyond the joke itself. The show has never been a careful or consistent handler of racial material. It has oscillated between genuine satirical intent and something that looks more like casual laziness about whose images and experiences it is using. The Cleveland recasting happened in the wake of that history, and it did not resolve the underlying questions about how the show handles race. It resolved the specific question of who provides the voice. The deeper questions remain open. There is also the matter of Arif Zahir's experience stepping into a role that had been held by someone else for 20 years, in a public and somewhat fraught context. Zahir had built his own following partly through Cleveland Brown impressions, and the match between his natural ability and the character's established voice was genuinely strong. But the circumstances of the transition meant that he arrived carrying the weight of the cultural conversation that prompted it, which is a complicated position for any performer. He was not simply replacing a voice actor, he was being cast in the context of a public discussion about race and representation in entertainment, and every choice he made would be evaluated in that context. His public statement at the time of the announcement was warm and genuine. He described Cleveland Brown as his favorite cartoon character of all time. He said he would not let anyone down. The sincerity was apparent, and the reception from the Family Guy community was, by the standards of internet commentary, relatively positive. The transition worked, in the specific technical and practical sense that the voice sounded right, and the character continued without significant disruption. What it did not do was settle any of the larger questions it was ostensibly answering. Whether casting a person of color in a voice role fundamentally changes the cultural dynamics of how that character is written and depicted, as opposed to simply changing who benefits economically from the role, is a question that the recasting left entirely open. The character of Cleveland Brown has always been written by a largely white writing staff. That has not changed. The representation argument for recasting is strongest when it addresses who is in the room making decisions, not just who is in the recording booth providing sounds. There is also the matter of the Quagmire voice situation, which is less dramatic but worth noting. Glenn Quagmire, as McFarlane plays him, is a sexually aggressive, morally uncomplicated character whose behavior toward women the show has always treated with an ambiguity that ranges from satirizing such behavior to simply presenting it as part of the comedic landscape. In later seasons, as cultural conversations about consent became more explicit and more mainstream, the Quagmire character attracted criticism that his behavior was being handled as comedy in ways that no longer felt acceptable. The show has made some adjustments to how his character is written in more recent seasons, though the overall arc of the character has remained consistent with what it has always been. The broader question of how a show's voice cast evolves over time, and what happens when the people providing those voices encounter the changing ethical expectations of a changing culture, is one that Family Guy shares with several of its peers. The Simpsons made similar changes around the same time, with white voice actors stepping back from characters of color. The pattern across the industry suggested something more systematic than individual ethical reckonings, a collective recognition that the implicit assumptions about voice casting that had governed animated television for decades were no longer tenable. The Lacey Chabert situation from the show's very early history is worth briefly noting in this context. Chabert originally voiced Meg Griffin in the first season of Family Guy, before Mila Kunis took over the role starting in the second season. The transition was not controversial in the way that Henry's departure was. It was a straightforward casting change in a very early period of the show's existence, but it established a precedent for voice roles, changing that the Cleveland situation would revisit decades later under very different circumstances. The voice cast of Family Guy represents, in a sense, the institutional memory of the show. The same voices have been performing these characters for over 25 years. Those performances carry enormous familiarity and continuity. They also carry the history of the show's decisions, good and bad, and the accumulated weight of choices that were made in a different cultural moment and are now being evaluated in this one. The reckoning with Cleveland Brown's casting is one part of that larger history finding its way to the surface, and it is unlikely to be the last. What is perhaps most striking about the show's entire history of controversy is not any individual episode or incident, but the cumulative picture they create. A show that nearly ceased to exist before it began, because its creator almost died. A show that was canceled and forgotten, and then resurrected by an audience that refused to let go of it. A show that spent years fighting with regulatory bodies and watchdog organizations and other shows and celebrities and federal agencies and its own network, and survived all of it. A show that made a nation grieve a cartoon dog, and then made them unsure how to feel about grieving a cartoon dog, and then brought the cartoon dog back and made them unsure how to feel about that either. The scandals and controversies of Family Guy are not a separate story from the show itself. They are the show itself, refracted through the prism of a culture that was trying to figure out what it meant that a cartoon about a dysfunctional Rhode Island family had become one of the most discussed and debated entertainment properties in the country. The show was always trying to get a reaction. What it discovered, repeatedly and in surprising ways, was that the reactions it got were often not the ones it planned for, that the world was more complicated than even the most irreverent comedy could fully account for, and that the line between envelope pushing and genuine harm is something that every creative work draws in a different place, and that no one draws perfectly. Closing thoughts. There is something quietly remarkable about a show that has been running since before some of its viewers were born, that has survived cancellation twice and emerged stronger each time, that has generated federal complaints in the hundreds of thousands and Hollywood feuds and congressional-level political controversies and lawsuits from American icons and viral conspiracy theories, and is still, as of right now, being watched by someone somewhere who just needed the sound of familiar voices to fall asleep to. Family Guy is not a simple show. It never was. Underneath the cutaway gags and the chicken fights and the jokes that go either too far or exactly far enough depending on who you ask, there is a complicated, often contradictory, endlessly generating history that most of the people watching have never thought about. There are the episodes that got pulled before they could be seen. There are the courtrooms where the show's right to exist in its current form was debated and defended. There are the regulatory offices where 188,000 complaints landed and were ultimately set aside. There are the conversations between a creator and a watchdog organization that started as combat and ended as something more nuanced. There is a viral conspiracy theory that attached a cartoon to a tragedy. There is a dog who died and then didn't. There is a creator who almost wasn't alive to make any of it. All of that is part of Family Guy. The show on your screen is the visible part of a much larger thing, a cultural artifact with roots and legal histories and creative battles and personal stakes that go far deeper than any given episode. Knowing about those things does not necessarily change how funny the show is or how often you reach for it when the night gets long, but it changes what you know about what you are watching, and that is its own kind of value. The show will keep going. The deal with Disney guarantees it through the end of the 2020s. The machine that was built from one person's ambitious pitch in 1998 will continue turning out episodes for audiences in the millions and eventually the hundreds of thousands and however many come after that. Whether the show that emerges from that process still resembles what Seth MacFarlane had in mind when he drew Larry and Steve in the mid-1990s is an open question. Whether it matters if it does is also open. What is not open is the fact that the history we have covered tonight is real. The controversies happened. The lawsuits were filed and argued. The complaints went to the FCC in numbers that still seem staggering. The creator nearly died on a Tuesday morning in September and then spent years making jokes about it. The dog died and came back, and the country reacted as though something real had been lost and then restored. That is all genuinely strange and genuinely interesting. And it belongs in the story of what Family Guy is, alongside every joke that ever landed and every one that didn't. Now you have that story. And whether this settled you gently into the night or kept you alert through all of it, there is more of this kind of storytelling coming. Hidden histories, quiet scandals, the stories behind the things you already think you know. If you want to be here for those, the subscribe button is right there. It doesn't cost anything. It just means the next time something like this comes out, you'll be there for it. And drop a comment and tell me the moment that surprised you most tonight, or the one you already knew. I genuinely read them, every one. Take care of yourself. Sleep well. And thank you really for spending this time here.